Is a very packed agenda. We have a revised agenda this evening from the printed versions that would have been sent out. So I suppose a good idea in terms of the substantive issues for me to just remind people what we're going to be looking at exactly tonight. First of all, we're going to be speaking to Lord Kerslake about right to buy for housing associations and the associated government policy for funding that. Then we are going to have the call-in with regard to the location of the leisure centre, and then we will be having Councillor Ian Wingfield's Cabinet Member interview. So they are the three substantive issues on the agenda this evening.
Can I just check, the residents for the call-in have been invited at 8 o'clock, I invited them, so you won't hear the item without hearing from them?
Of course not, no. Definitely we will make sure we will hear from them. So probably a good idea before we kick off any further is just for everybody to introduce themselves, if that's okay. So start off with you, Jasmine.
I'm Councillor Jasmine Ali, and I also chair the Education and Children's Services Scrutiny.
Councillor John Situ from Peckham Ward, and I'm a member of the Scrutiny.
I'm Councillor Tom Flynn, and I also chair Housing and Community Safety Scrutiny.
Shelley Burt, Scrutiny Officer.
I'm Gavin Edwards and I'm chair of the committee.
I'm Rosie Schimmel, I'm vice chair.
Norman Coombe, I'm the legal advisor.
Anida Samurai, leader of the Liberal Democrat Council Group.
Elisa Rajan, member of the committee.
Maisie Anderson, councillor for Newington Ward and member of this committee.
Rebecca Lurie, and I'm also chair of the Healthy Community Scrutiny Committee.
I'm Catherine Dale, and I'm councillor for South Bermondsey Ward.
Okay. Now the lights right on cue are fading, so let's jump up. So let's get a few of the formalities out of the way as quickly as possible. First of all, apologies. Do we have any apologies for members of the committee this evening?
Councillor Fleming.
Councillor Fleming.
Martin Bracknell.
And Martin Bracknell. Okay, notification of any items that I deem urgent. I haven't been notified of anything, so we can move on from that. Thirdly, the disclosure of interests and dispensations.
So just technically, the call-in obviously wasn't on the original agenda, so I added that in terms of constitution.
As a late item?
Yeah.
Okay, noted. Thanks, Shelley. So, disclosure of interests and dispensations. Any contributions that members of the committee want to make on members' interests? No? Great. Okay. The minutes of the last meeting, can we agree those?
Can I just make one comment,
Yeah.
sorry, Chair? Just on the kind of, like, what I appreciate we record the meetings now, which is why we're not full, but I just thought it'd be really helpful to kind of have very clear outcomes. So, for example, on the minimum wage stuff, what we actually are doing, I think you said you were going off to write a report, or whatever it was, but yeah, just to make it really clear what the actions are.
So if we're going to have, I think it's a fair point, if we're going to have briefer minutes as a result of the fact that we're filming the meetings, let's continue to have action points that are agreed. That's no problem. Yeah, let's do that from now on. Can we agree the minutes of the last meeting in any case?
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Right. Moving on to our first substantive item. So, first of all, just to set the context for this, we are looking into the issue of the government's policy of granting right to buy for tenants of housing association properties, and the associated policy of funding that by forcing councils to sell what have been described as expensive properties, however that's defined, and using the receipts of that in order to fund sell-off of housing association properties. So the reason we're doing this is partly to show the impact of such a policy, what that would be in a borough such as Southwark, but also to ensure that we as a council are as prepared as we can possibly be for what is a policy that could have a huge impact on a borough and the people living here. I think it's great that tonight we've got Lord Kerslake, who's come to speak to us and answer our questions. Just as a brief introduction, I will just set out the reasons why, the experience that he has, the reasons why we've invited him to come and speak to us tonight. Lord Kerslake was once Chief Executive in Hounslow and then Sheffield City Council. He was also Chief Executive of the Homes and Communities Agency. permanent secretary at DCLG and head of the civil service, and he became a peer in February of this year. If there's anything I've missed, let me know. We've had a quick chat before, and the way I'd like to structure this session, just so that it's not completely scattergun, obviously this is a policy area that has many and varied facets to it, is first of all just ask you just to say a few words on your perspective on this policy and the funding policy as well, and then for us to look at this in three general areas so that we have questions grouped around those areas. And I'd like those to be first of all from the perspective of a housing association. Clearly one thing I didn't mention is that you're chair of the Peabody Trust, which is obviously crucial. So from the perspective of a housing association. Secondly, from the perspective of government and how we might be able to influence that policy, joining in with others. And then finally to test a little bit how prepared we are, and to ask you some questions about the kind of things that we as a council should be doing to prepare for the introduction of this policy. So first of all, over to you, Lord Kerslake, just to say a few words.
Yes, well, thank you very much for inviting me, first of all. I think I'd like to start really with setting out my own views about the policy. And I say it's the policy in its current form, which is the one as announced in the Queen's speech. We await a more detailed paper from government. Conversations are going on as we speak, and the policy may change. At the moment, we're reliant very much on the headline announcements and what was in the Conservative Party manifesto and subsequent briefing documents. My very strong view on this policy is it's both wrong in principle and wrong in practice. I say it's wrong in principle because I don't believe these are assets that are governments to sell, put simply. If you take Peabody, which is the housing association I'm chair of, it was started in 1862 by George Peabody, a British-based, American-born banker who put $500,000 of his own money into this, and that would be worth at least $1 billion today. We've been around for 153 years, only 40 of which have involved public subsidy of any sort, and over 40% of our stock was effectively funded through charitable donations. So it seems to me quite wrong in principle that a charitable body's assets should be able to be forcibly sold by a government in pursuit of a particular policy. And that's kind of the first point I would make about wrong in principle. Why do I say wrong in practice? Well, I don't believe it will ultimately deliver government's intention, actually. I think the government have set a clear policy towards increasing home ownership. And in fact, home ownership has fallen pretty radically as a percentage of total housing over the last decade. The reason it's fallen is we've not kept supply going at the pace of demand, and that's particularly true in London. We should be building more than twice as many houses as we have typically built in London. And I think this policy will cut against the policy of new supply. It will undermine quite a few of the foundations. When you see it alongside policies like the rent reduction rather than the CPI plus one, so-called CPI plus one rent increase for housing association, I think this could have a very significant impact on supply. Secondly, I don't think the numbers add up. I don't think the receipts from how local authorities will match the amount they have to cover. They have to cover both the cost of the discount, effectively, which for somebody who's lived in a house for 3 years or a flat for 3 years could be £104,000. It has to cover the replacement of the property that the local authority has sold, and it has to make a contribution to the Brownfield Land Development Fund. And on all the calculations I have seen, the sales levels and the values of the properties simply don't hit those numbers. And then just the last point, and I'll stop here because I know there'll be lots of other questions, I think in practical terms, it's really hard to make the policy work effectively for London. And London will end up, under the current model, subsidising the rest of the country. And the reason for that is that the current policy is to sell properties, council properties, that are in the top third by value of the market in their area. Now, outside London, there'll be places where that's a tiny number of properties, maybe even zero. In London, it's huge, and if you're in Westminster, potentially Southwark and others, it'll be a half to 2/3 of the properties that become vacant. So very quickly you will see a stripping out of properties from places in London, and I think you will over time change the character of those areas, particularly as the properties that are sold by housing associations, from our evidence, nearly 40% end up as market rented private properties. So in every sense this policy doesn't deliver new housing, the numbers don't add up in my view, and the risk is that it will actually, far from creating better and more stable communities, they will create more unstable communities with less cohesion in those areas. So I feel quite strongly this is a policy that in its current form has many serious flaws to it.
Okay, thank you. That's really useful. So I'll throw this open to the committee, and I'll resist the temptation to jump in with a question myself. So first of all, Anoud and then Tom.
Thank you very much for being here, and I think you're probably preaching to the converted in a sense that I imagine everyone around here absolutely shares those concerns quite seriously, and I know colleagues of mine obviously spent lots of time trying to stop the Tories doing their evil doings, and it's a real shame actually that we ended up with a Tory majority and they're able to push this as one of their particularly foolhardy policies. I don't actually think kind of right to buy historically has been terrible. I know actually there's lots of leaseholders in Southwark who were pleased to have bought their council homes, but actually there have been issues particularly around the buy-to-let stuff which you've mentioned that haven't been managed, and the fact that we didn't get more council housing built as a result of right to buy under any government really. I suppose my two specific questions, you talked about Peabody stuff being wrong in principle because actually it hadn't all come from public subsidy. Is there any possible legal challenge there, therefore, that Peabody or other housing associations can pursue? And secondly, on the buy-to-let point, whether there are any safeguards or something, if this does have to happen, whether there can be protections in place from stuff that's sold to tenants being, at least not immediately, then just rented out for maximum income.
I think on the first point, I think it is an option legal challenge. We clearly would not want to go down that route, and certainly we, like other housing associations, we've been working with the National Federation and with government, seeking to persuade them to rethink the policy. And just to be clear, the objections I have are not per se about right to buy, because that's a policy that exists. You can have debates about the level of discount. I would have views about the level of discount, to be frank with you. I think 3 years and offering people £104,000 discount is an awful lot of money for tenants who are probably by definition the more wealthy or tenants anyway. So it seems a perverse policy, if you ask my personal view. But leave that to one side. This is about how this current policy is being taken forward. So it is an option. We will certainly not look to do it except in the most extreme situation. But in the end, Peabody has to look to its founding mission. It was set up to meet the needs of the poor and needy in London. That's what we were about as a housing association. And we can't lose sight of or lose our mission. That's what we exist for. So it's quite, as you can tell, a passionate issue for us. I don't know about the safeguards. There is, of course, a very loosely defined thing. If you sell after 5 years, you might have some requirement, but I'm not sure it's ever been, to my experience, enforced. So I think it's really quite hard, not impossible, to control it. You really have to actually think about the overall controls on the private rented market and the safeguards within that wider market, rather than just the specific issue. And I think just linked to that, one of the things I did a while back was to go around the Aylesbury estate. One of the big challenges with the Aylesbury estate, of course, is right to buy and the impact that has on the redevelopment, and I worry that it could have similar effects in other places for others. So I think it's a very significant issue.
Thank you. Tom?
Thanks, Chair. Got two if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks very much. The first one, you've got some strong views yourself on this area, but I was wondering whether you're seeing a consensus across the housing association sector, or whether there are people who aren't as sceptical about this as yourself. And also from a Peabody perspective, I know from my own ward, Peabody are building houses and are increasing their housing stock. And how would this affect your decisions to invest in future stock? Now, as far as I understand the legislation, you'd be compensated by government for properties that went to right to buy, but would this restrict your ability or make you think twice about building while this policy is on?
Yeah, I think on the so your first question was about the views of housing associations. Perhaps inevitably there are mixed views. I think the prevailing view is significant concern about the policy. There are some who said, and some privately you might say, well, this is a chance to bring in some big receipts to our housing association. I think that personally is a short-term view, but there are some who might feel that way. But taken in the round, I think the views of housing associations are that this, as I've said, are just as strong as my views. And what's been significant since I spoke in the Lords was how many people have come up to me and said we agree with you, including, I have to say, quite a few Conservative peers who've said we don't agree privately with this policy either, and peers who've been actively involved in the housing association world. So I think it's not uniform, but there's a fairly widespread view that the policy is very problematic. It's particularly problematic, by the way, in rural areas, because there aren't very many affordable houses in villages, and if you take them out, it's quite a big issue for those areas. So I think there's a widespread concern and a desire to see the policy changed, I think. In terms of Peabody's ambition, it's worth saying that Peabody have, in recent years, really upped its ambition on new supply in London. If you went back 2 or 3 years ago, we were very low in our numbers of new supply. We're now at a pipeline of 8,000. And it would take a lot for us to want to rein back on that. So we're going to review where we go in the next month or so. It's worth saying that it's not just the policy on right to buy, it's the rents policy as well that's been quite an issue. And I think the rents policy point is that previously the government, the last coalition government, gave a commitment to increase rents by what's called CPI plus 1 in effect. And that gave housing associations a clear kind of signal to borrow because there was a reliability about the rental stream. The recent announcement effectively has said it will go down by 1% per annum for 4 years, and then the indications are it'll go back to CPI plus 1, but given one promise has not been kept, people might be thinking on about whether it will be met in 4 years' time. And the reason that's important is because housing associations borrow against future rental streams. That's how they get such good rates, basically. And so it undoubtedly will get us to think about schemes. Probably the rental issue is as big, if not a bigger issue, as the right to buy. I think we may have to look at the mix. So we may say, actually, we're going to have to build more for sale than we do at the moment, and less for rent, which I think would be unfortunate given the demand and crying need for affordable housing in London. So that's a long answer, but that's where we are at the moment.
Okay, thanks. Right, Catherine.
Thank you. I just wanted to sort of pick up on the whole concept about home ownership, because there's kind of a presumption. You've said that you're not against the right to buy per se, but it feels to me that the tendency for people to own their own home is something that isn't necessarily as much of a reality certainly for sort of younger generations, than it has been in the recent past. And I just wondered about what the implications are for how we should sort of position social housing, because it seems that there is a real need for social housing, but the story about social housing is kind of changing, and how is the positive story told well, given the kind of current circumstances?
I think it's a very important question, really. I think my personal view is that we need more housing. We don't just need more housing for sale. We don't just need more housing for rent, market rent. We don't just need more affordable housing. It's all of the above, basically. And affordable housing has to form part of that deal. And by the way, I think the reality is that whatever the notional policy was of 80% of market rent, it hasn't been that in London. It's been lower. And actually, the policy was designed to get the grant rate down. And in fact, if you can deliver the houses with a lower grant rate and have rents at lower percentages, that seems to me fine. That's a personal view. But actually, it's a view I held when I was in government, advising government. So I think we need all types of housing to grow, and it includes affordable housing. And I think there is a risk, and I have to be careful what I say here, that affordable housing or social housing, let's call it social housing for this purpose, is seen as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. That it's seen as synonymous with failed estates and people who are struggling to secure work and things. And actually, for me, it's part of the mix. It would be a great shame if you saw people on low incomes essentially unable to live in central London at all. And over time, I don't think that's an outlandish thing to say might happen. So I think it's really important that and we'll come on to this in a minute, that we stick with the idea that we need different types of tenure, different types of affordability, and not lose sight of affordable housing and its role in all this.
Right, I've got Johnson, and then I'm going to move on to the kind of the wider issues regarding the way that this policy is developing at government level. So if people have got questions around that, we'll move on to that after Johnson's had a question, and then I'm going to jump in. So over to you, Johnson.
Yeah, no, as you quite rightly point out, and has been pointed out earlier, it's quite clear that the council's position and the local authority's position, local authority and housing associations, their interests are aligned in terms of challenging this policy. And just wanted to ask, what are your views as to how they're currently working together, and how do you imagine that relationship could be developed as a nationally or locally or regionally?
There's two bits in your question. I'll cover both. I think their views are aligned, but I think there's a risk, and I've said this in other places, that in responding to the government, there's a sort of picking off of different interests. So you sort the problem for housing associations out, but leave local authorities, particularly London boroughs, in a difficult place. I think it's really important there's a kind of joint effort to address these issues. It's why I've argued that the Chartered Institute for Housing should play a role across all the sectors, local authorities, GLA, others, to try and address some of these issues and make sure we don't find you solve one problem at the expense of another. I think it's really, really important that that's the way the debate goes. I think the collaboration between housing associations and local authorities is often very good. I think it's good in this borough actually, and particularly between Peabody and this council. So it's a long-standing one, but it isn't overall as good as it could be, in my view. I think there's some historic issues about housing associations or perceptions of them by local authorities that somehow they took away the job that they did, or go right back to those days. And I think that's unfortunate. I think housing association can be a very powerful partner for local authorities, and you should, in a way, embrace that opportunity, I think. And I have talked to a number of boroughs who said, well, we're going to do it ourselves now. We don't think we'll work with housing associations. And I think that's unwise. I think there's a lot of common interest we have on issues. So, Peabody puts about 1,000 people into work that must be in your interest as well. We can do things on health, I think, with you to prevent people trips and falls, people going into hospital earlier than they should have done, and to cut the cost on care, for example. So there's a huge number of common areas of interest, and I would want us to be seen as a resource, actually, for London boroughs, not just on the supply of housing, but on other policy issues as well, I think. And that's good in some boroughs like Southwark, but it's not as good as it should be in some others, I think, in truth.
Thank you. Well, I'm just going to jump in. Last question from the perspective of housing associations. One of the issues that's been raised with me about this policy is the difficulties that arise in managing estates and properties as a result of having right to buy implemented. One of the things, that's my father ringing me. One of the things that has happened, and we've had a housing commission in Southwark which kind of flagged this up quite strongly, was that actually by having right to buy, then having, as you say, 40% of those properties then being re-let to other people, it breaks down some of the community spirit on an estate. That can happen. That's part of what can happen. Sometimes you have people living there who are there for very short periods, don't feel that they're invested in that particular area, so they're there for a little bit, and therefore that their behaviour and the way that they keep the place clean, etc., doesn't necessarily live up to the standards that have previously been there. And it was actually flagged up as a really big issue when we had this investigation into housing in Southwark. Do you think that's possibly going to be a major problem for housing associations as well in managing the properties?
I think it will add to the management challenges in the way it has for local authorities. I think it will, particularly in London. I think it will have an impact. For all the reasons you've just said, what typically has happened in London, and there's plenty of research to back this up, that high numbers of the properties after the first purchase get sold on as a buy-to-let investment. The controls, as you rightly said, are not strong enough, and some of these areas you get high turnover, and the rents, of course, are typically 50%, maybe even twice as much as the social rents were. And so I think it will, just as it's created challenges for local authorities, I think it will create challenges for housing associations as well, in exactly the same way.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to jump in on the first question with regard to the way that this policy is developing, and I'll come straight to Jasmine after that. I'll ask you like an overtly political question, and you can answer it in yeah, I know. Which is no.
You can ask my daughter that.
Yeah. So there's obviously different approaches to the way that this policy might be challenged for those people who do think that it's wrong in principle. Some may say, okay, what we need to do is get into the detail and make changes on the way that the policy is implemented and try and shift it a little bit so that we get a better outcome. Or we take a full frontal approach and we challenge it and try and get this knocked down as a manifesto commitment that never gets delivered. Where do you sit on that debate?
Well, I think there's definitely got to be an engagement in the big arguments and debate, because from somebody who's been inside government, it's very hard to shift government unless there's a wider debate and critique of things. So I certainly think the more high-profile debates, conversations there are about the issue, the better in many ways to persuade government. But in the end, if you look at the kind of dynamics of this, government have a majority in the Commons. In the Lords, I'm absolutely clear from even just one vote that there's a high level of concern about the policy. But they also have the Salisbury Convention, which says you don't completely vote down the policies, the manifesto policies of a government. So I think there has to be negotiation and conversation, and this is the critical point in which it needs to happen. And in terms of what I think where the changes might come, I think first of all for housing associations they would want to be sure that first of all there are some what I call sensible exemptions. So properties that had no government money pre-75 shouldn't be included. I think it's a logic for rural properties to be out, sites where there's redevelopment happening, maybe even new build, because what's the incentive to new build if it's going to go after 3 years? And maybe you could then have, if you exempt those properties, an option that people could buy a new build property that was designed for sale by the Housing Association with the discount, so to speak. So what I call a sensible exemptions policy is quite important. Second thing is, I personally would argue for instead of giving people a complete cash discount, give them a combination of a cash discount they would have got anyway, possibly a bit more, and what I call an equity loan. So the equity loan would stand behind the mortgage, so they'd still be able to buy the property. They get it interest-free, the loan, for 5 years. Because it comes through the Help to Buy process, it's government funded in effect. So you don't then need to have the same desperate need to raise receipts from local authorities. And then you could have a more sensible policy on sales for local authorities, perhaps linked to high value properties as opposed to the need to cover the cost of the scheme. Then the final bit of the jigsaw, I think, would be a commitment that London doesn't lose out, really. So I think there's a kind of four-pronged approach to amending the policy that I think keeps with the original intention of government, which is to enable people who can buy to buy, but deals with what I think are the most difficult aspects of the policy. And on balance, I think that negotiation can and should go on really with government. And I've worked closely with Greg Clark. I think he's generally a very open-minded and pragmatic politician. So I think it is worth the effort.
Okay.
I hope that's a direct.
No, that's very helpful. That's very helpful indeed. Yes. Tom and then Maisie. So Jasmine, apologies. Jasmine first, then Tom, then Maisie.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I've been following this work, and I'm really pleased that you've raised it in the public domain. One of the things that I'm concerned about is obviously your experience with Peabody, but also the specialist housing associations, the Kaya Housing Association working with special needs, black mothers and babies, St Mungo's, obviously everyone knows about their work with the homelessness, and the role that they play in not just housing people, but actually housing and then resettling and supporting these wraparound services where you don't just house people and leave them to their own devices. Now, I'm worried about how the government can justify, that really, because on the one hand, it's basically cutting across a lot of government policy to work with troubled families, special needs, homelessness. And, in this era of doing more with less, how can they justify the costs that will increase as a consequence of not doing that specialised work?
No, I think you're absolutely right about the specialist area. Peabody do some specialist as well. I think one of the exemptions, which I didn't include, which I should have done, was precisely that. Specialist housing, that ought to be excluded from the list, and I think there will be a willingness for government to hear some of this. So I would be, in a way, having your own conversation about, look, we don't like this policy. That's pretty evident from what I've heard today. Don't call me sensitive, but
no, you're right.
But I think, given that if you are going to go back and say, look, if you're absolutely going to do this policy, have your own list of what you think should be exempted from the scheme for housing associations, and I think specialist housing is an absolutely obvious one.
Thank you for that.
Good. Okay, Tom.
Thanks, Kevin. Just going back to what the questions that Gavin was putting to you, and I'm particularly interested in your amendment to the Charities Bill. I thought that was an interesting way of approaching this. And you touched on the Salisbury Convention, that if there are large numbers of government side people also voting on an amendment like that, are we in new territory here with the Salisbury Convention? I know that I think it's a Liberal Democrat peer who said that that may have outlasted its use, and we might be into a different era. Or do you see an approach of perhaps more working with government. I mean, you talked about Greg Clark, for example. So on the charities bill, but also I believe you spoke about charitable benefactors as well, and about the impact that this will have. And it seems to me that, you know, we hear a lot about big society and things like that from the government, and this seems to be almost polar opposite of that in terms of discouraging people from outside government to provide assistance in housing. I'm just wondering if you had any, if you could elaborate on what
Yeah, sure.
you said before.
I think it is incumbent on us now, both informally and formally, to try and persuade government to amend the policy. And that can happen up to the point where they issue the bill, the housing bill, or the consultation paper, which, if there is one, and it can happen beyond that. So there's, you know, we'll have at least two bites of the cherry pre-announcement of the bill, which I suspect will come out at some point going up towards the Conservative Conference or just after, and after that. So there's that point one. Then the bill goes through the House of Commons and then to the Lords. You know, there's time to carry on that debate up until the point the legislation is passed. It doesn't. If you make changes that get to a policy that people could not say they're happy with, but they can live with, then that would be a result, in my view. It's still possible that, you know, government, that you know, the Lords will be so unhappy that it. But I think you've got to have tried before you would go as far as to, you know, vote down a piece of government policy in its entirety. The Charities Bill point was to put down a marker. It was to say, actually, this is a big issue. It's to test the water. And what was clear was, first of all, you know, the overwhelming vote on that issue was an enormous majority, and B, really how few Lords came to the kind of defence of the policy, if you see what I mean. So I think there is, you know, there is a definite issue here, and I think definitely there's scope to persuade government. But we should try that first before we get into an outright vote against. I think that's my first point. On this question of donations, I think you're absolutely right. I think why will people? I think it's a wider issue of charities, because once you've kind of moved over on housing associations, why not other charitable bodies? You know, it seems to me that that is a principle. That's why I say it's wrong in principle. But if people give them money, Peabody, you know, what would George Peabody say now if he was alive today? He gave his money for the poor and needy, and he shouldn't have that in any way frustrated. And if he was alive today, he might think on about doing it.
Thank you. Maisie.
Thank you. Thanks. My question kind of leads on from that, in terms of us as a borough and how we can most usefully approach this kind of advocacy effort. You said earlier you had your sort of list of sensible exemptions. I guess, you know, we could take a positive, constructive approach or a outright negative approach or a mixture of the two. And I thought, you know, given current political climate, new government majority, what would your advice be in terms of the most effective approach we can take to this kind of lobbying?
I think you've got to, as I said earlier, I think there needs to be a public debate where the arguments are waged. That's why I went on kind of radio and did the speech, and I think the more that is in play, the better, in my view. I think at the same time, you've got to see if you can push for change, because in the end, you know, it is a majority government that will be very resistant, and I know for certain that two quite senior people in the government are quite wedded to this policy. You can work that out for yourself, I think. But so it's going to take, if you wanted to get outright opposition, I think it would take quite a lot to stop it. I do think it is both articulating the concerns of Southwark and working through London councils. And if I have a concern about it, I referred to it earlier, that you might see a resolution of the issue for the housing associations. You might see a resolution for London and the mayor, and you might see the boroughs not the ones who aren't getting their issues addressed. So I put it as subtle as that, I hope. So I think it's crucial that the boroughs, through London councils, are as strong a voice on getting the right outcome for London as others might be.
Is that always the best route through London councils? Just, you know, or is there sometimes an occasion where, you know, we can try and get ourselves heard individually? No.
Both, I think.
Yeah.
The only reason I say London councils is because that is the voice of London's councils. So, and they are likely to be in the conversation with the mayor and with government. They're the ones who will be formally consulted. So, you know, when CLG has meetings to talk about this policy, it's likely to be London councils who are in the room alongside the mayor and so on. So I think you've got to play both routes. You might have your own channels, by all means use them, but I do think that there's got to be a very strong and well articulated view about what's the right outcome for the London boroughs. Across party, by the way, I think the issues are as serious, if not more so, for say Westminster and Wandsworth as they are for Southwark.
That's interesting. Okay, Rebecca.
Thank you. My question sort of ties into this, and you might sort of have answered it already, but one of the obvious problems with people amending legislation is that you get multiple different versions of essentially the same amendment, but different people will support different ones, and then ultimately they all fail because you haven't got consensus around one specific amendment. So how likely do you think it is that we'll be in a position where there will be joined up lobbying, or do you think that we'll have a whole array of amendments which might kind of differ very slightly and then might not actually achieve anything? And then who do you think, and therefore do you think there are some organisations that we should be looking to kind of lead the efforts that we can all come behind and try and get a consensus before anybody even gets to the tabling an amendment stage?
I think there's two bits to that, inside Parliament and outside. I think outside Parliament it is really pushing to have collaborative conversations between the G15, the NatFed, the Mayor's Office and London Council. So I think it's really crucial that we don't allow separation to happen too much there and people finding their own solutions. You can't absolutely avoid it, but I do think the conscious effort to say, are we in the room in the right conversations, is crucial in my view at this point, especially at this point in time, I think. So that's point number one. Inside Parliament, actually, I think from what I've seen so far, certainly in the Lords, there's a lot of commonality of view amongst the Labour side and the Liberal Democrat side on a lot of the issues on this policy. I can't say for the Commons, but in the Lords it's pretty clear where people stand actually. And I think if anything, so many of the Liberal Democrat peers are as strongly opposed as on the Labour side. So I think there is potential there for a common view on the right amendments to come through. I think the bigger worry for you is that something gets sorted ahead of that and London boroughs aren't fully addressed in terms of their issues. That's my honest view to you.
Thank you. Right, any more questions on that area? No, okay. So just finally then, as I said earlier, I wanted to try and pick your brains a little bit with regard to how a council such as Southwark might be adapting to and preparing for this policy. Now obviously that's slightly difficult at the moment because, as you've already said, we don't know all of the detail. And you know, I know from conversations I've had with officers so far, there's a lot of work taking place behind the scenes here at Southwark in order to try and people to get their heads around exactly what's going to be coming down the road. There's a lot of conversations taking place with the housing associations that are operating in Southwark as well. So that seems all well and good. But were you currently chief executive of a council like Southwark, what would you be doing right now? What would you be telling your housing officers to do to make sure that the council was ready for what was coming down the track?
Well, it'd be a bit presumptuous of me. I know you have a very strong team here.
We have a fantastic chief executive.
So I would not want to comment
absolutely.
On the team here. I think are very good, actually, by the way, because I've met them. So in broad terms, I won't talk about Southwark specifically.
Sure.
In broad terms, I think number one is to have an absolutely clear sense of what your own policy is. I felt for a long time local authorities should be at the forefront of the strategy on housing, not just the managers of housing, but the people who do the thinking and the driving of the policy on housing. I think that's crucial, really, and knowing what you want, what is your policy goal, set policy goals is crucial. I think the second thing you've already touched on is to work hand in glove with housing associations and others to see what they can do to secure and deliver your wider housing goals, your mix of are there ways to retain affordability? I mean, there are some potential options of unregulated housing associations and things. People are exploring these options to maintain affordability. So, work hand in glove with the providers. I think, personally, I think it's very important to keep open the option that you do some delivery yourselves. I think there will be a mixage. I'm not one of those who says it should only be housing associations. I think local authorities have a role to play here as well in the future on this. And I think crucially, and this is obviously particularly true, you have huge influence through your land assets, and there are ways you can secure results on the land assets and how you sell land and dispose of it that might protect affordability. There are models, for example, that decouple the land asset value from the sale value, and you can hold value. So look at how you can creatively use your land assets to do things, basically.
Okay.
I think those are kind of a few quick responses to the issue for the borough. I don't, if the policy prevails, it will have an impact, I think. Yeah. But those are ways in which I think you could mitigate it. I think one last point is, even if the principle isn't defeated, the detail is really important. So, for example, there's at least some suggestion that the deduction for sales won't be an actual figure, but a formula-driven deduction from boroughs, almost regardless of whether you actually sell that number of properties or not. That would be, I think, a major problem for you. So the devil's in the detail of this policy, as well as the kind of wider points I've talked about.
Good. You mentioned just in passing there unregulated housing associations, and you said that was an option that some people. I must admit that's not something I've come across in looking at this issue so far. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I won't say too much about it, but I mean, I think it's at least an option if you to explore whether you have a component of your housing associations or others that is unregulated.
Yeah.
Therefore, is not covered by the same set of policies.
Okay.
I'll put it no foot stronger than that. I'll leave you to join the dots.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions from the committee? No. Great. Well, look, thank you very much for coming and speaking to us tonight. Really appreciate it. And yeah, we'll move on to our next agenda item. If we just take a couple of minutes break.